Lion Pride PT 12. Anger, fury, unbridled rage. None of these could come close to sufficiently describing Lord Voldemort's emotional state. In all of his great life he had never felt such betrayal. He'd thought of himself as a very benign ruler. He always rewarded his faithful when they had earned his benevolence, but he ruled over them with an iron fist. For he could not allow his followers to question his power or his ultimate goal of a pure world. But two had left his flock. Two of his Death Eaters had not only questioned his way, but had lost their faith in his greatness. They had run to his enemy for shelter. At this very moment, they were likely telling Albus Dumbledore, so-called leader of the light, all they knew in an effort to protect themselves from the horrors of Azkaban. Or trying to trade secrets for Lucius' release and sanctuary from prosecution. Whatever the reason for their betrayal, they would not succeed. He had never truly had faith in Narcissa Malfoy. She always looked horror-struck whenever she witnessed any lesser being be tortured or killed. She had never truly convinced him of her devotion to the pure blood way of life. And despite the fact that she was of the Black line, one of the most powerful pure-blood families of all, Narcissa was weak, and spineless. She had never showed any of the true power she supposedly possessed. She was worth nothing more than to be trophy upon Lucius' arm, and a way to unite two families. He'd tolerated her pathetic pleas to forgive her husband for his failings at the ministry. But those were mere whispers compared to the sobbing and insistent begging for her worthless waste of a son. From the moment Draco had been branded, Narcissa had been at his feet begging for the Dark Lord to recant his orders to Draco, and allow another to kill Dumbledore. Yes, it was likely that Draco would fail to kill Albus Dumbledore. The boy was just a step or two above Squib. It was also true that giving the job of killing the most powerful wizard of the light was a punishment to Lucius for his ineptitude in retrieving that blasted prophecy. The Dark Lord had never truly intended for Draco to take the life of the greatest threat to the New World Order. That honor would go to Severus Snape, who had been chained to the old fool's side for far too long. A fitting reward for all his years of loyal service, to be sure. Snape had even smiled when he was informed. But the absolute gall that the Malfoys had in deserting his service was simply unforgivable. What made it worse was that they were now under the protection of Dumbledore, and he could not get to them. It was only a temporary problem, however. Once Dumbledore was dead, all his enchantments and wards would fail, and then he would send his best hunters to bring them before him where they would face the consequences of their actions. Perhaps Greyback would enjoy a little sport. Other things were troubling the Dark Lord. His forces were now in place within the Ministry. The Ministry was set to fall, and once he received word from his agents within Hogwarts, he would triumph. The problem was in the timing. He had launched his campaign at the new moon. He had finally found a blood ritual in which he would purge himself of all the tainted blood which flowed through his veins, destroying him from within. He had his Hogwarts agents identifying the most powerful pure-blood students that were not of families in service to him, or of Slytherin's noble house. He knew he would have very little time in which to test these candidates, so he had worked up a list of criteria for his young spies to look for. Only one had sent back a list of subjects who fit his criteria. The Dark Lord had done research into the backgrounds and family histories, and was pleased at what he'd found. 4 young students had stood out as the best. Mandy Brocklehurst, Cho Chang, Cormac McLagan, and Terry Bood. All purebloods, all very powerful magical people, all from powerful pure-blood families. Their blood would cleanse him and return his power to the level he had before that thorn in his side, Potter had somehow managed to defeat him. There was one more young woman who had caught the Dark Lord's attention. A young woman who had proven that she was not only powerful, but from a very pure line. He had learned of her existence when he had learned all that had happened before his arrival at the Ministry last year, and he had been researching her since that time. For he initially believed she could be used as a tool to get Potter. Now he knew that she was a very strong witch, whose blood would strengthen him more than Potter's tainted blood could ever have. Voldemort smiled to himself as he imagined making Potter watch as he drained the boy's lover of her life in order to strengthen himself, just before he killed him. And that was the last issue that was irking the Dark Lord. Harry James Potter. There was only one thing that stood in the way of total oppression of the British magical world. That was the uncanny luck of that insolent brat, Potter. But his plan would come to fruition. There was no way for Potter to escape once the Death Eaters made their assault on the ancient castle. The Dark Lord would strike Potter down in front of the students and teachers, and then, there would be not question of his power. Then, with his power restores, and all his enemies disposed of, he would at last begin to reshape the world into his vision of perfection. He would announce the existence of the magical world to the Muggles, and subjugate them into service to wizards. Just as it should have always been. Thinking over his plans had a strange calming effect on him, and his anger was soon abated. Only time stood between him and his destiny. He had only to wait for the new moon. Albus Dumbledore was not a happy man. He would have very much liked to live the rest of his days oblivious to the inevitable end. Instead, he had only a matter of weeks, at most. All around him, the grounds of Hogwarts were blooming in rebirth as spring had swept away the last signs of winter. Even the castle itself felt warmer. Hagrid had proudly announced that morning that 4 baby Thestrals had been born, and were thriving with the rest of the herd in the forest. The headmaster had even notices a nest of birds near his office window, with 3 tiny hatchlings, chirping merrily, waiting for their mother to bring them food. It all reminded him how precious life truly was, and that his was nearly at its end. Severus Snape, a man whom he trusted above all others, had just reported that the ministry was set to fall in a matter of days. Lord Voldemort's forces were all in place, and unfortunately, they had no idea who Voldemort's new spies within Hogwarts were, and they could not just go and check each student for the mark. Students had rights, and they had to protect those rights. That put Dumbledore in a very awkward position. He had to protect Harry again, which wasn't what the boy needed. Harry had come so far, and Dumbledore had no doubt in his mind that Harry was ready to face Voldemort. And if all the Horcruxes were gone, Dumbledore knew in his heart that the fight would be short, and Harry would emerge the victor. But until that time, Dumbledore didn't dare take a chance of the Dark Lord and the Chosen One facing each other. For now, Dumbledore had to prepare for the inevitable invasion of the castle. All the students needed to be protected at all costs, but Harry and his friends even more so. They were the key to victory. If they fell, all hope would be lost, and the world was doomed to subjugation and death. Dumbledore knew that time was running out now, and he only hoped to be able to prepare everything before Voldemort's forces moved, which Snape assured him could be at any time. When that happened, his life, the long legacy of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, would finally come to an end. Dumbledore had no fear of death. In fact, he was actually intrigued by what awaited him in the next realm. He had much to answer for, to be sure, but he also felt he would be leaving this world in much better shape than when he had been born to it. He hoped that his defeat of the Dark Wizard Grindelwald, as well as his efforts to end the reign of Lord Voldemort, would be taken into account. Still, as he gazed down upon the 5 teens, sitting under a large shady oak tree, he knew that he should have been more proactive in his efforts with Voldemort. Too many had lost their lives needlessly. Too many had believed in him, and received death for their faith that Dumbledore would find a way to fix it all. He had never encouraged people to think of him as a god, but then again, he'd never tried to dissuade their beliefs either. None of that truly mattered now. All that mattered was giving Harry all he needed to fulfill the destiny he'd been given so that the young man could get all he deserved. Happiness, love, God's willing, a house full of children. Dumbledore couldn't help but smile as he saw the young woman lean over and kiss the young man on the cheek, and then slap his arm playfully as the boy had very obviously been cheeky. He'd watched the young couple closely since the previous year, and he could not, in all his 150 years, remember seeing another two people appear to be so in love. It was that fact that gave Dumbledore such hope for Harry. He would fight to his dying breath to protect those he loved. Harry's friends gave him courage and hope. They inspired him, just as Harry himself inspired so many others. Dumbledore was counting on Harry's natural charisma to spur the world into action. It would be Harry that rallied the people to rise against Voldemort's regime. With a great sigh, Dumbledore tore his eyes away from the happy scene before him so that he could finish what he had intended to do over the weekend before he was called back to Hogwarts. Again, Dumbledore had to smile. It had been Harry who had turned Draco Malfoy around. Dumbledore was not a fool, and he knew that Harry and Draco would never be friends, but he hoped they would at least come to respect one another one day. After all, Severus had been trying ever since he'd learned of the boy's task to turn the boy around, and Draco had proven to be more stubborn than a mountain troll. Draco was being eaten alive by his guilt over what had happened to poor Millicent Bulstrode, as well as the constant unyielding fear of what was to become of his mother should he fail. Through the discussion in his office, Dumbledore was able to discover that Horace Slughorn was unknowingly in possession of a poisoned bottle of mead, that had been meant as a gift to the headmaster. Not only that, but Madame Rosmerta had been under the Imperious curse for some time. And Draco had been actively trying to mend a broken vanishing cabinet in the room of requirement to allow Death Eaters to enter the castle. It turned out that Draco's mission was not only to murder the old headmaster, but to help the Death Eaters in their attack on the school. Draco begged Dumbledore to find a way to save his mother, to protect them from the Dark Lord's wrath. It had been easy, but temporary. Getting Narcissa to the school was as simple as an official letter stating that a meeting over Draco's academics was needed. Once she arrived, she and Draco were sent to number 12 Grimmauld Place until they could get out of the country. Thanks to the Fidelius charm and several other powerful wards around the house, the Malfoys would be quite safe. That is, until they fell upon Dumbledore's death. Not they needed to worry about that. They would be long gone by then, and hopefully, Lord Voldemort would not be alive himself for much longer. With a bit more luck, it was possible that young Draco could learn how wrong he had been following in his father's footsteps and become a man in his own right. After all, Dumbledore had seen countless arrogant, nasty young men turn into pillars of society. Men to be looked up to and emulated. Dumbledore hoped that would be the case with Draco Malfoy. That one day, he would restore glory to his family's name. With Lucius out of the way, perhaps it was more possible than anyone could hope. Dumbledore pushed those thoughts out of his mind. He still had much to do yet. He stepped over to the large cabinet where he kept his pensieve. He took several tiny crystal vials, and returned to his desk to place them in a small velvet-lined box. Making sure they were secure, he shut the lid and locked it. His weathered fingers lingered on the top of the high-polished wood for a second, as he thought of what those vials held. Next he opened the drawer to his desk and took out a number of items, which he then placed in a small leather pouch. He then took the glimmering sword of Godric Gryffindor, and slid it into the magically enhanced pouch, and tied it shut. That finished, Dumbledore sat down to complete the letter he'd begun writing 2 months ago. He had written this letter many times, always having to change things and rewrite it. He had much to say and he wished to get it right, as it would be the last thing he would ever write, and in essence, the last thing he would ever get to say to the young man who'd truly meant the world to him. He was going to break a number of oaths, but as he would be dead when the boy read the letter, it didn't matter anymore, he deserved to know everything. He took his time, wishing to get every syllable correct so Harry would know exactly why Dumbledore had done what he was going to do, and understand. It took several hours before it was finished, and he was satisfied with the results. He sealed the letter in an envelope, and set it on top of the polished wooden box, which he then banished with a wave of his wand. Looking at his desk where the last tools and weapons he could give to Harry had been a moment before, Dumbledore sighed. It was only an hour before dinner, but he had one last thing to do, and he knew that he would not be back until quite late the next morning. Plucking his traveling cloak off the coat rack, Dumbledore set off again for Hogsmeade, where he planned to continue his search. He was so close now, and he knew that tonight, he would at last discover the resting place of yet another of Lord Voldemort's Horcruxes. Today had been truly good day in Harry's humble opinion. It was a full week now since he and his friends had managed to corner Draco Malfoy and expose him to the teachers as a Death Eater. However, Draco hadn't been punished for his crimes. Millicent's death was considered an accident, which did nag at Harry, but at the same time, he couldn't fault Draco for doing what he could to try and protect his mother. Maybe if he hadn't been so daft, he would have come to the headmaster on his own. However, Voldemort wielded fear like a ninja wielded a katana. Harry couldn't even imagine how he would have acted had he been Draco. There was a very palpable change within the school now that Draco was gone. Daphne and Tracy said things were still slightly strained within Slytherin House, but overall, the school was cheerier. And a few more Slytherins were reaching out and attempting to make friends beyond their own house. Mostly it was only with purebloods, but Harry felt it was a good start at least. The night before, Harry had led a very productive meeting in the Great Hall. The hall had been alight with over 50 fully corporeal patroness charms. He had been saving that lesson for a while, focusing more on spell casting and the like, but last night he had felt inspired and thought he would give them a taste. He was shocked at the tenacity of all the students, and even more when they had been able to master the spell. Harry had then reminded them all that while they could easily do the charm now, the true test would be to do the charm when it mattered in battle. After the meeting ended, Harry and Daphne had stolen away to the room of requirement. It had started as it usually did, with deep kissing, and gentle caresses. The room had provided them the intimate setting that they enjoyed, and Daphne had worn a new silk slip under her school uniform. Harry loved it when she wore things like that for him, and Daphne loved how something so simple could make her feel so beautiful. Actually, she knew it was all due to the way Harry would stare at her when she wore such things. However, that night was the very first time that the slip had actually come off of her body, and she had allowed herself to be exposed before him. She had always kept it on, allowing Harry's hands to roam, but never allowing him to see her undressed. She still felt ugly because of the scar she had received that night a year ago. But last night, when Harry actually kissed his way down that scar, she forgot it all. He didn't care. He loved her, and desired her no matter what, and he proved that to her. Harry had been utterly awed by her beauty when she had pulled the slip over her head, and stood before him, looking so nervous and scared. He didn't hesitate. He took her in his arms, and lifted her up and carried her to the bed, laying her gently on the fire-warmed duvet, where he began to devour her with his kisses. His hand slid up and down her body, making her arch her back in excitement. But nothing had been quite as exciting as when he'd found her sensitive nipple with his lips. The gasp, and the way she had nearly leapt out of the bed was enough to convince Harry he was doing the right thing. She moaned his name and growled deep in her throat as he paid very close attention to her breasts. Things got even more intense as he kissed further down her body. Neville had told him of something Hermione really liked him to do one night when the conversation had turned to one that boys usually found after sports and the dangers of war were exhausted. At first Harry was horrified by the topic, but he knew it was because he was picturing Neville and Hermione in the all together. Once he was able to push those images out of his mind, he was able to appreciate the core of the conversation, and give it a lot of thought. That was why as he slid his thumbs into the thin lacy waistband of Daphne knickers, there was no trepidation. He wanted her to gasp and call out his name again. He couldn't explain it, but it charged something in his brain, and he liked it. Daphne's first reaction was shock. She had been lost in the sensations Harry's lips were giving her, and she had not been paying too much attention to what he had been doing. She couldn't even remember lifting her hips so he could slip her knickers off. But when she felt the warm velvet of Harry's tongue in her nethers, she felt as if she'd been put in a body-bind curse. Her whole body locked up with surprise. It took a few moments of nervous tension before she began to relax. And then, things got very, very interesting. At first, it tickled. Then the sensations changed, and she began to get shivers of warmth running up her spine. Harry's hand slid up her body and caressed her breasts, and his lips and tongue continued to work on her in ways that were indescribable. And then he found a spot and it made her back arch so much, Daphne thought she might turn inside out. That spot seemed to be what Harry was looking for, and he went after it with serious fervor. She knew exactly what it was that was building in her stomach, and spreading to her legs. She knew exactly why her breathing was becoming so ragged, and why she was grabbing fistfuls of his hair, and pressing him harder into her, and begging him to keep going. She knew her orgasm was building, even though she had never felt one before, and when it happened, and she saw stars. She knew without a doubt why girls sighed and looked so dreamily when they talked about certain boys. In that moment, when she couldn't speak, or even breath as her body locked up, and she held onto Harry's head for dear life, Daphne felt she might have solved the riddle of life. It came down to orgasms. That was why we were all here. To experience that single glorious moment at the hands and tongue of someone we truly and deeply loved. When her grip finally relaxed, and Daphne collapsed back onto the bed, Harry kissed his way back up to her mouth, where she kissed him very passionately. Harry swore that he would thank Neville, though he would never ever tell him why. When Daphne released him from the kiss, still panting, and gasping for breath, Harry wrapped his arms around her, and held her closely as she settled down. They talked idly, and she questioned him several times on where he got the idea to do that, though he wouldn't tell her at all. A while later, they had fallen asleep, forgetting about curfews or anything else. It was simply too nice being together to think of anything else. Harry awoke the next morning to a very pleasant sensation. When he opened his eyes, it was to find his truly stunning nude girlfriend repaying him for what he had done to her the night before. She had apparently vanished his remaining clothing, and was now using her mouth on him. It had been a surprise to be sure, but not disagreeable at all. It wasn't long before she managed to make him climax. Daphne admitted to being taken aback by the mess, but she didn't find it disgusting as she thought she might. And with a wave of her wand, he was cleaned up in a blink of an eye. It was then that they realized that it was in fact morning, and they had not made it back to their common rooms. Thankfully, Harry was prepared a bit. He took the shrunken knapsack from his pocket, and with the help of his father's invisibility cloak was able to get her back to her common room. And himself back to Gryffindor Tower so they could both clean up, and at least try to appear as if they had slept in their own beds the night before. None of their friends bought the act, and made them aware that they were all in the know of part of their activities the previous evening, though they were nice enough to not joke too much about it. That day, the group spent wandering the castle, and trying their best to act as a group of ordinary teens. They studied for a bit for their upcoming exams, and finished their homework before enjoying lunch, and spending the afternoon under a large oak tree near the Black Lake. Things had been going so well that week, they had all nearly forgotten the one thing that posed a serious threat to them all. "Any ideas on who has Harry's map yet?" Hermione asked, closing the book she had brought out with her. "The cast of usual suspects, but now that Draco's gone." Tracy shrugged. "It's just hard to imagine any of them with the brains to pull it off." Daphne sighed, leaning into Harry. "Are we certain Draco didn't have it?" Neville asked, still suspicious of the former Slytherin prince. "I told you." Harry sighed. "Dumbledore made him go through his trunk to make sure there was nothing dark in there. Draco even submitted to Veritaserum, so Dumbledore could be sure he wasn't trying to get one over on the Order." "He didn't have it." "Someone has to have it," Tracy said, ripping a clump of grass out of the ground. "But no one has made any claims about knowing the castle or anything suspicious. No one's gone disappearing for long periods of time. That we know of," Daphne added. "Whoever has it is being way more sneaky than Draco ever was." Tracy sighed. "I still can't figure out what anyone would be using it for, outside of keeping tabs on Harry." Hermione shook her head. "Still trying to work out what nefarious scheme the possessor of the map was up to. We just need to keep our eyes and ears open." Daphne shrugged. "Has Dumbledore found the next Horcrux?" Neville asked. "If you can find the rest of them, none of this will really matter, will it?" "I'd still want the map back," Harry said. "We'll find it, Harry." Daphne smiled sweetly, and snuggled a bit closer to her boyfriend. Harry smiled and wrapped his arms tighter around Daphne, who sighed contentedly in his ear. He wished that his life could always be like that moment. Calm, serene, nothing to worry over. He looked at his friends, smiling, talking about exams, and studying, and what they wanted to do in the future. Harry wondered if it were possible that he and Dumbledore could manage to destroy the remaining Horcruxes and kill Voldemort before school started again in the fall. Then he might finally have a year without any sort of life or death drama. "Keep dreaming, Potter," he thought morosely. Nott was tired and filthy and intensely pleased with himself. Thanks to Potter's map, he had discovered all 7 secret passages that led into Hogsmeade. The first 4 he had managed to get into were all warded. He had felt the magic before he had entered them, which was fortunate, as he didn't wish to be caught. The next one he found led right into Honeyduke's cellar. That one had allowed him to procure sweets nearly any time he wished, with no one the wiser, and he hadn't had to spend a canute. The 6th passage, he hadn't dared to explore as it was guarded by that menacing tree. Nott had seen innocent birds pummeled into mush. Nothing in this world would ever get him to go near that tree. The last passage had unfortunately caved in. However, Nott knew he had to provide more than one entrance into the castle. So, he had worked, mostly at night to try and break the wards on the 4 passages, and over the weekends, to clear the caved-in passage. That had been the more difficult, as he had not wished another cave-in. But today he had finally finished, and found himself emerging from a cave about a quarter of a mile from the 3 broomsticks. From his spot at the cave opening, he could see almost the whole of Hogsmeade, with Hogwarts on the hill above it. He had done as he had been asked. He was going to be rewarded above all others. Pulling up his sleeve, Nott touched his wand to the wriggling black mark upon his forearm. An instant later, Rudolphus Lestrange stood before him, staring coldly at the teenager with disdain. "What have you to report?" Rudolphus Lestrange growled. "2 passages have been opened." Nott said proudly. The first is in this cave, and will bring you out on the 4th floor. The second is in the cellar of Honeydukes, and will bring you out on the 3rd floor. Is there nothing closer to Dumbledore's office? Lestrange glared. The other 4 passages are too heavily warded, and I have no idea where they start, though I know they're all somewhere in Hogsmeade. There's still one more, but I don't know why anyone would attempt it, as it's guarded by the Whomping Willow. Very well. I shall report to the Dark Lord. You will wait for the signal, and then rally those loyal to our cause to fight the staff of the castle. The Dark Lord has one more task for you. Lestrange explained what he was expected to do now, and left as soon as he finished giving the boy one last command to keep tabs on Longbottom. Nott was gobsmacked, and it took nearly an hour before he could even get himself to move and return to the castle. He could never in his wildest dream imagine being asked to accomplish what he'd just been asked to do. And yet, after all he'd managed, he couldn't even think of a single reason why he would fail. He was going to climb the ranks quickly. Soon, he'd stand at his lord's side, revered above all others. Very soon, the world would change for the better. It was a very weary headmaster who returned to Hogwarts late Sunday morning. He was sure that he had at last located the resting place of another of Voldemort's Horcruxes. He had felt so much residual magic, that he had no doubts in his mind. Now it was only a matter of getting to the damned thing and destroying it. And for that, he would need Harry. His plan was to wait for a week, and allow himself time to recuperate and prepare. Harry would attend his classes, and enjoy time with his friends. Then, on Friday evening, he and Harry would return to the seaside, and Dumbledore would allow Harry the opportunity to prove how much he'd learned over the year. And then, together, they would destroy another of those blasted soul anchors, and sever yet another tie the Dark Lord had on this realm. Then he could concentrate on whatever Horcruxes remained. Dumbledore! Snape called out, just as the headmaster entered the entrance hall. He looked just as tired as Dumbledore felt. Severus, my friend, it has been a very long night. I just wish to. It's going to happen tonight. Snape cut him off. Dumbledore looked into the black eyes of his defense teacher. Snape gave him a very meaningful look, and Dumbledore sighed heavily, and nodded. Please be so kind as to bring Minerva and Hagrid to my office. We have much to do. Harry had received the letter at lunch, and things had become very tense since then. Tracy, Neville, Hermione, and Daphne stood just outside of the great oak doors, awaiting Dumbledore, as Harry note instructed. Only Harry was supposed to come, but Harry's friends wanted to see him off. The note was very simple. Dear Harry, I have located the next one. Please meet me at the main entrance of the school at 5:30 this evening, and please remember to come prepared. They all knew what it meant, and they all wanted to wish Harry and the headmaster luck on their expedition. Daphne remained very close to Harry, holding his hand tightly in hers. She hadn't said a word since lunch, and whenever she looked at Harry, her eyes would sting with tears. Neville checked his watch, and was about to announce that it was time, when Dumbledore's voice greeted them. I see we have well-wishers. Dumbledore smiled gently. Very well, please take a moment to say farewell, but try not to take too long. We have a long journey ahead of us. Neville grasped Harry's hand, and they stared meaningfully at each other. Neville gave a curt nod, and Harry smiled appreciatively at Neville. Just be careful out there, mate. Neville smiled. Harry grinned, and nodded again. I'll be back before you know it, Harry said. Hermione launched herself into Harry's arms, hugging him tightly and sniffing, trying to keep herself from bursting into tears. Harry patted her back softly. I'm going with Dumbledore, Harry said softly. Nothing bad's going to happen. I can't help but worry, Hermione admitted. I know, Harry said, giving her a comforting squeeze. When Hermione slipped herself out of Harry's arms, Tracy replaced her, which surprised Harry a bit, as Tracy had never hugged him before. You come back safe, because I don't want to spend the rest of my life trying to comfort Daphne, she said, trying to sound fearsome, but the tears in her eyes and the shakiness of her voice gave her away. I'm actually more worried about what she might do to me if I get hurt than you. Harry chuckled. Tracy punched his arm as she slipped away from him. That left only Daphne. She stared at him, tears falling down her face. Harry closed the distance between them, capturing her lips with his and a very strong kiss. He poured everything he felt for her in that single gesture, hoping that she knew how much she meant to him. It took a moment, but she finally slipped her arms around his neck and held him as close as she could. It was Dumbledore clearing his throat that finally made them pull apart. I've got to go, he said softly. I'll be waiting up for you. I want to see you as soon as you get back so I know that you're all right, she said, her voice cracking. She gave him one final kiss before letting him out of her grasp. Neville, Hermione, Tracy, and Daphne all watched as Harry and Dumbledore walked slowly down the path that led to the front gates. They watched until they could no longer see either of them. One by one, they began to drift back into the castle, until only Daphne remained, staring at the now closed iron gates of the school. She knew without a single doubt that Harry would return, but her heart just could not shake the feeling that something horrible was going to happen. She was so happy that she had slipped the vial of liquid luck into his jacket pocket while he had been kissing her. She only hoped that he found it before trouble found him. The two men walked silently until they had passed through the iron gates. She cares a great deal for you, Harry, Dumbledore said, not looking at his young charge. I know. I don't think I've ever cared for anyone as much as I do for Daphne. I love her. A fool could see that. Dumbledore smiled, a soft chuckle coming from beneath his snowy beard. I must admit I'm a little curious as to what it was she slipped in your pocket. What? Harry turned questioning eyes on the headmaster, before shoving his hand into his coat pocket to discover a tiny crystal vial on a thin leather cord. Harry recognized it at once, as he'd seen it around her neck several times. Felix Felicis. She gave me her luck potion. Harry whispered in awe at what Daphne had done for him. She had been saving this for a while, he knew, though she was always evasive whenever he asked what she was saving it for. That was very selfless of her, Dumbledore remarked, as he gazed at the tiny vial in Harry's hands. Though I do not think we shall need its assistance tonight. Better to save it for another occasion, but keep it handy, Dumbledore encouraged. I would like it if you donned your cloak at this juncture. Harry stared at the little vial for another moment before shoving it back into his pocket and retrieving his shrunken knapsack from his pocket. He enlarged the bag to pull his cloak out before shrinking the bag once again. He quickly threw the cloak over himself before following Dumbledore into Hogsmeade Village as the sun was beginning to descend in the distance. I know you have not yet passed your apparition test yet, but I am told that you have been making excellent progress, Dumbledore said as they walked together. Harry noticed that he barely moved his mouth as he spoke to him. No doubt he was trying to appear as if he were just going to the village on his own. I guess so. Harry shrugged. That's good. However, as you have not passed the test yet, and we wish to keep our activities out of the attention of the Ministry and Lord Voldemort, you shall have to allow me to apparate us this evening. If you would take my arm, Harry. Harry had barely clasped his fingers on the headmaster's arm before he felt the telltale squeezing sensation. He remembered the few times he'd been operated over the summer, and how uncomfortable the sensation was. Time had not improved it. When the sensation finally abated, his nostrils were filled with the scent of ocean air. His ears were pounded by the sound of waves crashing against the cliffside. "Where are we, sir?" "The same place that a very young Tom Riddle visited with other orphans. There is a small village not too far, but I'm afraid that I have not learned its name. We need to start walking as we have quite a hike ahead of us. Follow me if you would, and I think it is safe enough for you to remove your cloak now." Harry tore his invisibility cloak off and enlarged his knapsack once again. After stuffing the cloak back inside, he hefted onto his shoulder, feeling it might be better to keep it handy now. Dumbledore had not been exaggerating. The hike down the side of the cliff was very long, and nerve-rattling. Several times, Harry very nearly lost his footing, as chunks of rock broke away and fell into the churning sea below. Harry had never felt as anxious as he did navigating his way along the very thin so-called trail. It was little more than natural erosion that had made their path, and Harry felt that it hadn't done a very good job. That, or Dumbledore just liked the thrill of rock climbing. Either way, Harry hoped they could move a bit faster. Dumbledore moved very cautiously down the cliff face, picking his footing very carefully. The sun was getting lower in the sky now, and it was getting harder to see, but after about 20 minutes, Dumbledore stopped and shouted over his shoulder so Harry could hear him over the crash of the surf. "Our path ends here, I'm afraid. We now will have to swim to our destination. Light your wand, Harry. It is quite dark, and try to stay close." Harry watched as Dumbledore stepped into a large crack in the cliff face. Harry followed the old headmaster through, and was a bit surprised to find himself standing on the edge of a small pool, with Dumbledore nowhere to be seen. Harry felt a bit of panic rise in his chest and took 2 steps forward, only to find the floor had disappeared. Harry fell into the pool, the icy water chilling him right to the bone. Despite the shock of falling into icy water, Harry could see a bright light in the water moving away from him, and realized that it was Dumbledore. Harry shot to the surface of the pool, took a huge breath and submerged himself again to follow Dumbledore. It was very dark, and terribly cold in the water. Harry pushed himself through, noticing how confined this underwater cave was. He couldn't help but thinking this would be a very good spot for an ambush. Pushing such thoughts aside, Harry followed Dumbledore's lit wand, hoping they would get out of the water soon. Just as soon as he finished the thought, he could see Dumbledore's lit wand rising. Harry pushed himself a little harder through the water, and at last his head broke the surface of the water and Harry found himself in a very dark cave. Harry climbed out of the water and saw Dumbledore drying himself with his wand. Shivering, and teeth chattering, Harry mimicked the headmaster and began to dry himself as well. When he was finished, he cast a warming charm on his jacket. "Well, that was invigorating, wouldn't you say?" Dumbledore asked jovially. "If you say so, sir," Harry said rather dryly. He looked around and saw that they were in a small cave with only the pool they had come from. There was barely enough room for them to stand on before one of them might find themselves back in the frigid water. "Harry, I would very much like it if you could tell me what we need to do to continue on," Dumbledore said, looking expectantly at the young man with him. Harry gave a questioning look at the headmaster for a moment before he realized that he was still being trained. Harry nodded, and closed his eyes to center himself. Reaching out with his magic, Harry almost immediately felt the disgusting imprint of Lord Voldemort's magic. It was just as oppressive and foul feeling as it had been at Godric's Hollow. Harry could feel that the magic was centered on a section of wall. A section that seemed to be asking for sacrifice. That can't be right, Harry said, opening his eyes, and turning to the section of wall that was now singing out to him in malevolence. What is it? I have to be misreading it or something, Harry said, reaching out to touch the wall, and feeling pure abhorrence at the feel of the cold jagged stone. I think it's asking for a sacrifice. Very good. Dumbledore smiled. Though I think it's more along the lines of payment, though wither term would work in this instance. I believe it is designed to weaken whomever would be trying to gain entrance. Payment? Payment of what? Have you not guessed? Harry turned to see the headmaster giving him a strange look in the wand light. Harry turned back to the wall, and touched it once again. He took another deep calming breath and focused to see what kind of payment was required for entrance. In his mind all he could see was red. At first he was confused. What could Voldemort want someone to give that would weaken themselves, and would be red? Harry slapped his forehead. Of course, it was so obvious. It was the one thing that Voldemort valued above everything. It wants blood, Harry said, turning to see Dumbledore approaching him, one of his hands bleeding, while the other held a small silver knife. Sir, you should. Harry, your blood is much more precious than mine. The older man smiled as he began to rub his bloody palm all over the wall. Harry took a step back and watched in horrified amazement as the wall began to vanish before his eyes. Dumbledore also stepped back, and began to wrap his wounded hand in white linen from his pocket. This way, Harry, Dumbledore said, relighting his wand, and leading Harry through the new opening in the wall. Harry was truly surprised to see a smooth path cut in the floor of the new cave. He followed the headmaster deeper into the cave, noticing that their path was sloping steadily downward. Before he realized it, Harry and the headmaster were standing on the shore of a vast underground lake, that seemed to have no end. Dumbledore was looking very intently around the cave, and Harry guessed he was likely trying to feel if there were any traps or wards they might have to break. Then something caught Harry's eye. There was a green light coming from the middle of the lake, very faint. Sir, do you think that's where the Horcrux is? Harry asked, pointing his wand towards the light. I have no doubt. The trouble seems to be getting to it, as I am sure that swimming there would mean death. What do you mean? Harry asked, looking at the water with trepidation. I believe that the lake plays a very essential part in whatever we must do to obtain the Horcrux. Disturbing the water will prove, I think, most unfortunate for us. Harry nodded his understanding, and then began looking along the shore for any clues how they might get to the light. Sir, over there. Harry pointed to a large rock that appeared to have a chain wrapped around it a few feet away from them. Harry led the way over, and both of them began to examine the stone and the chain for traps. It was Dumbledore who figured out the puzzle first, and with a flick of his wand, summoned a very rickety-looking boat from the depths of the lake. Harry watched the boat rise out of the water, and glide towards them. When the boat bumped against the rocky shore, Dumbledore tentatively stepped into the boat, testing it carefully. I believe we shall be safe in this, he said to Harry, waving the young man over. Harry stepped into the boat and Dumbledore gave another flick of his wand, and the boat began to move slowly across the obsidian surface of the lake. It was deathly silent as they floated towards the faint green light, and Harry found himself staring at the black surface of the water. They were halfway across when something floated near the surface, and made Harry lump back, nearly falling overboard. There was a face. A face in the water. He shouted, shattering the deathly quiet of the great cave. I had thought as much. Lord Voldemort's victims, no doubt. Made into in fury. As I said, we are not meant to disturb the water. In fury. Harry said to himself, cautiously going back to look over the side of the boat. He remembered the ministry leaflet that had arrived at the Durs Ellis the day after he'd returned home, as well as Snape's lesson about the reanimated corpse of the dead. Harry pushed through all the garbage about the first time in Fury were ever spotted, or how one might control such an abomination. The only thing he needed to know was how to fight them. Fire, he whispered as he remembered that the only thing useful against Inferi was fire. Harry began to think of a few different fire spells. It wasn't too much longer before the rickety boat bumped into the rough, craggly rock of the island. Harry saw that, while still faint, the rather nasty green light was much brighter up close. Not only that, but it was emanating from a pedestal, which held a large stone basin. Harry followed Dumbledore up to where the pedestal sat, and as one, they both peered into the basin to see a glowing green fluid. A potion? Harry asked, looking up to Dumbledore, who was still staring at the nasty-looking green liquid. Indeed. Dumbledore said, standing up, and glancing at Harry. It does seem rather anticlimactic, doesn't it? Dumbledore slipped his wand out of his robes, and gave the basin a few waves. Nothing happened. He gave a flick, and then a slash. Still nothing. Then, a little cup that had heretofore gone unnoticed by both Dumbledore and Harry, began to shake, drawing their attention. Well, it seems we have little choice. Dumbledore said, picking up the cup. It needs to be drunk. You will recall, of course, the stipulations I put upon your accompanying me. Harry was too gobsmacked to do anything but nod. It seems very likely that this concoction might debilitate me in some way. No matter what happens, you must make sure that I drink every last drop, understand? Harry's brain caught up and Harry began to argue, but Dumbledore held up a finger to stop his protestations. This is more important than anything, Harry. I must have your word. Dumbledore gave him a very pointed look. Harry didn't like the situation. He didn't like that someone was putting their life on the line to protect him, especially seeing as it was Dumbledore. Sir, I really... Your word, Harry. Dumbledore said, a bit more forcefully. Harry knew he had no choice now. Their priority was to get the damned Horcrux, and this appeared to be the only way. Reluctantly, Harry nodded. Dumbledore gave the barest of smiles and dipped the cup into the basin, filling it up to the brim. He held the cup up to his mouth, and gave a little sniff. Interesting. Smells like lemon drops. The headmaster said wryly, and Harry shook his head, trying to keep the smile off his face. To your health. Dumbledore inclined his head, and then, tilted the cup, and drank its contents in one large swallow. Harry watched the headmaster's face, as his eyes drooped a bit, and he shivered intensely for a few moments. Eyes remaining closed, Dumbledore hurriedly dipped the cup into the basin again, refilling the cup, and bringing it to his mouth, drinking it quickly again. When he was finished, Harry saw that he was now holding onto the basin for support, and his face was contorting with what appeared to be pain. Dumbledore was whimpering a bit as he dipped the cup for a third time, bringing it to his mouth again, and swallowing his third cupful. This time, the cup clattered to the ground, and Dumbledore gave a great racking sob. Ariana! He cried. No. Harry's heart went into his throat. He had no idea who the headmaster was talking about, but knew they didn't have time for a question and answer period. Harry bent, and found the cup, and filled it with the potion before going to the headmaster and offering it to him. Sir, it's okay. Everything's okay. Here, drink this. Dumbledore gave a wary look, but drank the cup of nasty green liquid. When it was gone, he let out another heart-wrenching wail of pain, begging forgiveness for his crime. Confused, Harry refilled the cup again, and again made Dumbledore drink. Again and again, Harry made the old man drink the sickly green potion, and each time, Dumbledore's wails of pain and pleas for forgiveness grew worse. They all seemed to center around someone named Ariana. "She's fine, sir, I promise, but you need to drink this." "You have to, sir," Harry said, pushing another cupful of potion at the headmaster, who was now turning his head away, refusing to drink the stuff. "It's only a little more, and then we can go see Ariana." "She wants to see you, sir, but you have to drink this." Harry tried, but the headmaster kept refusing, saying he didn't want any more. "You have to, sir, we need to get the Horcrux, remember? Remember where we are, and why we came, sir. You have to drink it all. We need to beat Voldemort, remember?" Dumbledore looked as if he understood, and allowed Harry to pour another cupful down his throat. Once again, Dumbledore sobbed for Ariana, and his crime. He kept begging forgiveness as tears streamed from his eyes. Harry wanted desperately to absolve the man of whatever wrongs he felt he had committed, but knew only this Ariana could do it. Standing up again, Harry went to the basin to find that it was all but empty, and lying at the bottom was a rather plain-looking locket. Harry grabbed it up, and examined it in his wand light. It was nothing like he had imagined the locket of Salazar Slytherin would look like. Still, they had it. Stuffing it into his pocket, Harry set the cup in the basin, and went to help Dumbledore up. "Sir, we have it. We're finished." Dumbledore didn't seem to hear him, but sat against the pedestal, breathing shallowly. "Sir? Professor Dumbledore." "Water," Dumbledore said after a long, terrifying moment. Harry nodded, and went back to the basin to grab the cup. He cast a water spell into the cup, filling it with cool, clean water. But as soon as he went to give it to Dumbledore, the water evaporated. He tried 2 more times, with the same results. "He wants to weaken whoever enters," Dumbledore had said. "Sir, we have to get out of here. I promise you can have all the water you want, but we can't stay here." "Please, Harry," Dumbledore said feebly, reaching out for the young man. "Come on, Sir," Harry said, pulling the old man to his feet and helping him into the boat. Harry got himself into the boat, and helped Dumbledore to sit up. The headmaster told Harry which spell to use to get the boat moving again, and Harry complied. Harry took his knapsack, and began rummaging through it, hoping there might be something in it that he could give the headmaster, but nothing seemed appropriate. Burn salves, blood replenishing potions, strengthening solutions. "Water, please, Harry." "Soon, sir, I promise." Harry listened to Dumbledore's pleas for water, and his ragged breathing all the way back to shore, praying that the headmaster would be okay until he could get him back to Hogwarts. Finally, the boat made back to where Harry and Dumbledore had first arrived, and Harry, with a great deal of effort, managed to get Dumbledore back onto the shore without disturbing the water. He was thankful, because he was unsure if he would be able to handle an army of Inferi on his own at the moment. Harry found a small stone, and transfigured it into a cup, which he once again cast the water charm. This time, the water did not evaporate, and Dumbledore was able to drink. The water did much to improve the headmaster's condition, and he was able to stand, though he leaned on Harry's shoulder as they made their way back up the path. Harry wasn't surprised to find that the entranceway had sealed itself again. Before Dumbledore could protest, Harry cut his hand open on some of the sharp rocks, and spread his blood on the wall so it would open. The swim back was made harder, as Harry was helping Dumbledore, who was very weak now. The journey back up the cliff was even more arduous than it had been originally, as it was very dark, and raining now, not to mention trying to keep Dumbledore upright. But finally, Harry and the Hogwarts headmaster finally made it back to where they had started. Harry fell in a heap, trying to catch his breath, while Dumbledore lay next to him, his breathing even more labored than before. "Harry!" Dumbledore gasped. "Harry, we must destroy it now." Harry sat up, still breathing heavily, and reached into his pocket. Dumbledore had managed to get to his knees, and had pulled what Harry recognized as a basilisk fang from his robes. "Open it, and hold it down," Dumbledore ordered, and Harry unlatched the little clasp. What happened next took both of them by complete surprise. Nothing. The locket opened easily, and Harry saw that inside was a folded piece of parchment. "Harry! Harry, give it to me," Dumbledore said, his open hand outstretched. Dumbledore took the locket and examined it carefully, before unfolding the bit of parchment and reading it. There was a pitiful groan and Dumbledore slumped. "What's wrong?" Harry asked. Dumbledore held out the parchment so Harry could read it. "To the Dark Lord. I will be dead long before you read this, but I want you to know that it was I who discovered your secret. I have stolen the real Horcrux and intend to destroy it as soon as I can. I face death in the hope that when you meet your match you will be mortal once more. Rab. It's a fake?" Harry asked, looking at Dumbledore, who looked so frail and weak. "Who's Rab?" Dumbledore shook his soaking head, and began trying to stand. "We need to get back to Hogwarts." Dumbledore said. He was shaking terribly, and Harry could hear his wheezing clearly, despite the wind. He quickly got to his feet, grabbing the fake locket and stuffing it, and the forgotten basilisk fang into his knapsack before shrinking it and stuffing it into his pocket, and helping the headmaster to stand. Harry got a shock when he took hold of the old man's arm, and felt the familiar uncomfortable of apparition. An instant later, he found himself in Hogsmeade, just beside the Hogshead Inn. "Where have you been, Al? What the hell is going on up there?" a ragged-looking man asked, stepping out of the bar. Harry was struck by the resemblance the two men shared. "I had business to attend to," Dumbledore said shakily. "Al, you don't look so good. You need to get some help." There were a few distant screams, and Harry turned to see people in the streets, and they all seemed to be looking towards Hogwarts. Harry slowly turned, and it seemed as if time slowed. There above the great castle, staring down at them from the clear night sky, was the most heartbreaking, gut-twisting, frightening thing Harry ever saw in his whole life. The dark mark had been cast above Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. "Abe," Dumbledore gasped, clutching his chest. "We need brooms. Please like and subscribe."